Hello, folks. This is Dr. DeValley, and this lecture is about culture-bound syndromes. This refers to particular illnesses which are just found among members of a particular culture or of a particular type of cultures. And that's what it's about. There are about 20 slides in this lecture, so I will have to speak quickly, and on some of the slides I will just let you read them because the whole presentation has to take less than 15 minutes. Okay. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4 on page 844 manual describes or defines a culture-bound syndrome as recurrent, locally specific patterns of aberrant behavior and troubling experience that may or may not be linked to a particular DSM-4 diagnostic category. Many of these patterns are indigenously considered to be illnesses, or at least afflictions, and most have local names. Most generally, culture-bound symptoms comprise several kinds of illness or affliction, all of which are defined as culture-bound, and therefore have been interest to medical anthropologists and ethnopsychiatrists, and that they do not have a one-to-one correspondence with the disorder recognized by Western allelopathic nosologies. Most culture-bound syndromes were initially reported as confined to a particular culture or set of related or geographically proximal cultures. Here are some common culture-bound syndromes. Amok, which is found in Malaysia. You've heard the expression someone is running amok. Well, that's where it comes from. It's a dissociative episode characterized by a period of brooding followed by an outburst of violent, aggressive, or homicidal behavior. There is also Arctic hysteria, which is found among the Alaska Natives and the Canadian Eskimo or Inuit. There's also the attack of nerves in Latin America, brain fag in West Africa, Coro in Malaysia, the mal de ojo, the evil eye, in Spain and Latin America, and the Wendigo psychosis, which is found in Native Americans in Central and Northeast Canada. I'll give you a moment to read the descriptions to these. These diagnostic entities, both individually and collectively, have been the subject of a large and contentious body of literature. Now, are they best explained within the conceptual framework of Western psychiatry, or are they best explained anthropologically as manifestations of structural and functional elements operating in the societies in which they are found? While I personally think that sometimes there is a correspondence between the culture-bound syndrome and illness of conceptual framework of Western psychiatry, for the most part, I think they fall under the blue hypothesis of the explanation for them. Now, these two slides are following two examples of culture-bound syndromes. One is called amafufunia, and it's a serious disorder described among the Zulu and Xhosas of South Africa. Let me give you a moment to read this slide. By the way, at any time you wish, you can halt the video by clicking on the button on the bottom of the video so you can read something before it moves on. Another illness is one called a moak, which is one of the best known of the culture-bound syndromes. Now, the following chart shows what I think is the theoretical perspective for the development of culture-bound syndromes. In other words, why would a culture develop a particular illness? The boxes in yellow really are part of a sequence uh, uh, based on the research of John Whiting. The one in the light green is my hypothesis. So let's start at the upper left. A society's ecological and techno-economic dynamics will select for modal personality traits. If you viewed my lecture on the layer cake theory of culture, you will understand what that means. Now, uh, that would lead to a particular selection for child training behaviors. In other words, to produce a particular modal personality in a culture, it has to begin with the child training behaviors when the child is young. And those training behaviors will lead to specific adult personality traits. And that in turn will be a recurrent complex of personality traits that result in a culture's adult modal personality. In other words, it'll result in personality characteristics that most members of the cultures have. Now, my hypothesis is that when the modal personality undergoes stress, it will have aspects and symptoms of mental illness consistent with that particular personality. In other words, the type of modal personality produced by a culture, when it's under stress, it'll produce mental illnesses consistent with that kind of personality. And I'll explain more on this in a bit. For example, here is a specific hypothesis developed from the theory. If ecological and technological dynamics require cooperation among adult males, in other words, that they have to work together, then the child training practices and initiation rites will tend to encourage dependent modal personality traits, what you might think of as sort of a mama's boy. Now, values and worldview associated with dependence will tend to emphasize things like group loyalty and the submission of the individual to the group. When subjected to extreme stress, mental illness symptoms will tend to be hysterical and dissociative in nature. In other words, when a dependent personality is under stress, it'll lead to more hysterical or dissociative symptoms. Now, on the other hand, if ecological and technological dynamics require independence among adult males, then the child training practices and initiation rites will tend to encourage independent modal personality traits. In other words, the children will be raised to have independent personalities. And the values and worldview will emphasize individualism and self-reliance for an individual. Now, when subjected to extreme stress, mental illness symptoms will then tend to be more depressive in nature. If you look at our own culture, we would follow this pattern. In other words, we require pretty much independence in our personalities, and our child training it does encourage that. And also our values and worldview emphasize individualism and personal self-reliance. And the most common illness, mental illness in our culture and Western culture, tends to be depressive in nature. Okay, so thus these charts express what I said in the last two slides visually. The techno, ecological, and economic dynamics of an environment will either favor cooperation among adult males, such as among the Eskimo, or it'll favor independence among adult males, so an example among the Cree Indians of northern Canada. If it's cooperation, then the values will emphasize group loyalty and submission to the individual, a collectivistic culture, and that'll turn will result in hysterical or dissociative mental illness symptoms. And on the other hand, independence on the right, the values will emphasize individualism and self-reliance, and those mental illness symptoms would tend to be depressive. Now, here are a couple of photographs of Eskimo Inuit peoples. They lived in an environment where almost all the food was provided by the males. So to make, and sometimes during the winter when the males went out to hunt, there'd be snowstorms, they would get lost, they couldn't find the igloos, and so a dependent personality was very important because the man wanted to be with his group, wanted to be with his wife and children. It favored that cooperation. This is a slide about showing some shaman's mask. I'm going to move on here. And here is another photograph of a Alaskan shaman curing a boy. Now, on the other hand, the Cree Indians lived in northern Canada in quite a harsh environment. They were hunter-gatherers, they lived in small groups, and they really emphasized independence in adult personality. This is an example of a Cree settlement in winter, a man with his wife and children. And this is their terrain in the summer. You could see this is a hardy terrain which would favor individualism and mental illness among the Cree was the windicopsychosis, which is a depressive type of illness, and as opposed to the Eskimo culture, which has a more hysterical type of illness when it breaks down, the Arctic hysteria, as it's called. Now, I did some research, and this slide shows a list of over 100 cultures that I looked at the mental illnesses in, using something called the Human Relations Area Files. And here in this slide, it shows the symptoms in terms of their frequency. The first column on the left and marked off by the red shows like what occurred, violent distractions. They were reported like 36 instances of insane behavior, possession by spirits, hysterical. These are the larger numbers of frequencies. On the lower right these are symptoms that occurred less often. But if you look at them at the lower right, these tend to be much more depressive type symptoms, crying, grimacing, insomnia, while those on the upper left, the red ones, are much more of dissociative, the hysterical type. So among simpler societies, it appears that when mental illness occurred, it does tend to be much more often among the dissociative types in terms of symptoms. And that's all for now. I wanted to thank you for listening.